And then just a couple of quick promotions. Our June program will be June 15th, also on Zoom, and Charlie Brown from the Northeastern Kingdom Audubon Society will be presenting about birds of the Northeast Kingdom. Charlie led a trip for our group, I think it was 2 years ago, and the group saw all kinds of cool birds, so that should be a good program. We are bringing back Birds and Brews, which we're very excited about. The next one will be June 16th, the night after our June program, and that will be at the Whetstone Station.
Sit around, drink beer, and talk about birds.
At 5 o'clock on the roof of the Whetstone. And then the summer picnic will be July 27th. We have not confirmed a location or a start time, but that is the
These burgers.
Mark that off. And then I'm putting our website in the chat. That's the best place to go if you're trying to stay up to date on programming. I try to keep that updated pretty regularly. And then one more thing real quick before we start the presentation. Vermont Land Trust acquired a property in West Brattleboro that they are they're doing some intentional habitat work to try to improve it as bird habitat. They are removing invasives and they're doing some intentional clearing in the forest canopy. And they are looking for folks to basically come out and bird it so that they can get some data about what birds are in space, both before they complete their work and after they complete their work. And it is, if you take Western Ave west out of Brattleboro and you turn right on Meadowbrook, it'll be on your right just after you cross the brook. There's a sign there. We're going to get an eBird hotspot set up soon. So if you're an eBirder, you can find it on there and report your sightings on there. If you're not an eBirder, you can just email me what you see and I can get that over to Vermont Land Trust. That should be kind of a cool thing to learn about.
Hey, Corey?
Yes.
Maybe we should remind people to mute themselves so that our home noise doesn't interfere with the presentation.
Yep, absolutely, Susan. And I will try to stay on top of it. If I hear a lot of background noise, I can go through and kind of remute folks. Please don't be offended if I do that. Just trying to keep it so everyone can hear. All right, without further ado, tonight's presenter is Chris Rimmer from the Vermont Center for Ecostudies, and he's going to tell us about Vermont's very special bird, the Bicknell's thrush.
Well, thanks, Corey. It's really nice to be here. I am going to give you a whirlwind tour through 30 years of working on this very special bird. You're right, it is special. And let me just very briefly tell you that the Vermont Center of Ecostudies, which many of you know, you've worked with us and through us, is a small nonprofit. We're headquartered in Norwich. There are about 15 of us. We're growing. I can't fit everybody on the intro slide anymore. And basically our mission is to advance the conservation of vulnerable wildlife through doing good science and monitoring and using community scientists like yourselves to collect data across the landscape. So that's the synopsis. And we work on a variety of wildlife, not just birds. Birds are arguably our bread and butter. We've been working to conserve Vermont's formerly endangered, no longer, common loon population down in the lower right for 30 years, really. Where we've been studying grassland birds like bobolinks, following them to their wintering grounds in South America. We've worked on vernal pool breeding amphibians. We're monitoring vernal pools across the state now, with many of you helping us. We're working on pollinators like bumblebees and native bees. We did a butterfly survey, 5-year project several years ago. And we're studying mountain birds, of course, and those are just a few. But at the heart of our work are our volunteers, amateur naturalists like you. We call them community scientists. We used to call them citizen scientists. That term is no longer quite as in vogue, so we're calling them community scientists. But we appreciate all that you do, and we couldn't do what we do without that backbone of dedicated folks. So I am going to talk to you about Bicknell's thrush, this small migratory songbird, close relative of our state bird, the hermit thrush, and how it is a strong link across our hemisphere for conservation, science-based conservation. And really, I'm going to have to give you an overview because after 30 years of studying this bird, we've learned so much. There's still many, many questions that I just can't cover it all and do it all justice. But You might ask, well, why Bicknell's thrush? What's special about Bicknell's thrush? Well, first of all, it is one of the most rare songbirds in Eastern North America, breeding songbirds. We don't have a precise population estimate. We think there are about 70,000 or so in the US and another 30 to 50,000 in Canada. So collectively, you know, there may be 100,000 birds. For a global population, that is really small for any species of organism. And as you can see from this crude map, at both ends of its migratory range, north and south, it occupies a very restricted, limited distribution. We'll get into that more, but here in the Northeast, it's on these pockets of habitat, mostly at high elevations, and here in the Greater Antilles on only 4 islands, and we'll talk some more about that. At both ends of its range, it's a specialist on specific habitat types. Here in the Northeast, it's conifer forests, mostly at high elevations. In the South, it's wet broadleaf forests, also mostly at high elevations. And across its range, it faces an array of threats, which collectively, and we'll get into some of those, make it a officially globally vulnerable species. It is not federally endangered or threatened in the US. It is federally threatened in Canada. Our government doesn't think that we really know enough about it and have compelling evidence for declines to formally declare it endangered. But it is, without question, highly vulnerable, and it's one of the highest priority species for conservation among long-distance migrant birds in the Northeast. So there's a little bit of background. So thinking about the breeding habitat, we're going to start with that. Transport yourself to a mountaintop. You've all been on one in the Northeast in Vermont. This could be, it's not. It could be Stratton Mountain or Mount Snow, but this is montane forest dominated by balsam fir, lots of dead, and this is a summer home of the Bicknell's thrush, exclusively in the US, only high elevations. Now, to give you a very brief history of this bird and how we've come to know it. On June 15th, in 1881, this gentleman, Eugene Bicknell, who was an amateur ornithologist and botanist, he was a financier actually from Long Island, was on Slide Mountain in the Catskills, the highest peak in the Catskill range. And he spied 2 unfamiliar looking birds. He knew they were thrushes, but he was pretty sure he'd never seen them before. So as ornithologists did back in those days, he didn't have Swarovskis or Zeiss or Leica binoculars, but he did have a shotgun. So he collected them and still holding them in his hand, did not recognize them and sent them down to the Smithsonian, whereupon they were identified at that time as a race or a subspecies of the gray-cheeked thrush, which most of you know, I'm sure, is a northern, more widely distributed thrush that we only see during migration here, that nests from basically from Newfoundland all the way over to Alaska through Canada and actually even into Siberia. So the bird became called Bicknell's thrush. Now, a little digression. Some of you may be aware that, if you're not, this may not be a welcome surprise. There is a movement afoot to eliminate what are called eponymous bird names, birds who bear the name of a person. And this is a very serious movement. It's based in issues of racial equality, and I won't get into it, but I think it's going to happen. And we are potentially no longer going to have a Bicknell's thrush. I don't know when it's going to happen. Anyway, that's an aside. Right now, it's Bicknell's thrush. Now, fast forwarding, I had the privilege and honor and pleasure to meet 2 of Eugene Bicknell's grandsons here on Mount Mansfield way back, almost 20 years ago. They came up there, Gene Bicknell Doggett and his brother Wick, came up to see our work, and I caught up Bicknells for them in our nets, and there's a picture of Gene. And so a nice, really full circle experience for me, and I've kept in touch with both of them, and they've become good friends and supporters, actually, of our work. So the story gets picked up by this gentleman, George Wallace. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a Vermont farm boy who was born in Waterbury Center, and did his doctoral dissertation work on Bicknell's thrush on Mount Mansfield. He was interested in learning about its natural history, in trying to determine whether or not it warranted being its own species. But really, it was a classic natural history study over 3 summers. He lived up in one of the what are now GMC huts, and he worked with his wife Martha here, who was, by all accounts, a very hard worker, found a lot of nests, and he could never have done what he did without her. Now, you may be wondering about this little bird on the table. This is little Bicky, who was a juvenile, a nestling actually, that they effectively rescued from an abandoned nest. Why its parents would have abandoned it, maybe it would just lag behind in development from its siblings. Anyway, they took it into their Butler Lodge where they were living, and it spent over a year with them, actually. It went back to Michigan with them where George was doing his work. He toured it down to DC. It met all kinds of VIPs, apparently. Sadly, it met an unfortunate end the following summer when George and Martha were boiling water for spaghetti and little Bicky decided to take a bath. It's bad timing, but I sort of had to tell you that. But anyway, George wrote a classic treatise, a monograph, and in his opinion, Bicknell's thrush, he looked at lots of specimens and collections, did not warrant being its own species. He supported it continuing to be a subspecies. Now, in 1995, and I won't get into the details because we really don't have time, there was some work done comparing very closely Bicknell's and gray cheek thrush, looking at specimens, looking at vocalizations, looking at the ranges, which completely do not overlap, and finally looking at the biochemistry. And a proposal was made to the American Ornithologists Union, now the American Ornithological Society, that Bicknell's thrush warranted being its own species, a distinct species. And that proposal was accepted. And so since 1995, Bicknell's thrush has been a distinct standalone species. That didn't really concern me when I got interested in studying this bird, which was in 1992. I went to a talk that was given by the scientist who made this proposal, a Canadian biogeographer, basically museum guy, Henri Ouellette. And he just got me thinking about the fact that we had this bird in our backyard, basically, in the mountains of Vermont and other ranges in the Northeast that we knew almost nothing about. We knew it was rare. We knew our mountains were threatened by acid precipitation and other things, and it just begged to be studied. So I set forth, and here I still am, 30 years later. All right. So thinking about these mountaintops where Bicknell's thrush breed, it's useful to think of them as islands of habitat, sky islands projecting up into the airspace. And they really are, if you look across the landscape, islands of unique habitat with these conifer forests that you don't find anywhere else really in New England. And if you look at a map of where those forests are distributed from the Catskills, which is a very tiny area, only 5 square kilometers, through the Adirondacks, our long linear green mountains, the White Mountains of New Hampshire, the Mother Lode, and then all the way up to Baxter State Park. That's it. It's less than 1% of our landscape is occupied by this forest type. And the range of these forests, or the elevation at which they grow, decreases as you increase in latitude. So for every 1 degree, you drop about 270 feet. So down in the Catskills, it's about 3,700 feet, and way up in Maine at Baxter State Park, they get down as low as 2,300 feet. So a tiny area, relatively speaking. So here we are on a classic peak. This is Whiteface Mountain in the Adirondacks, just showing you both in the foreground, up close view of the habitat, and in the far distance. And I just want you to notice some of these bands of what look like dead trees. These are called fir waves, and they're naturally occurring areas of mortality. I won't get into the reasons that they occur, but they sort of march in waves up the mountain, and under them is a very thick regrowth of fir and spruce, and birch and other things. And that's where you find Bicknell thrush at their highest densities in this virtually impenetrable habitat. These forests are very dynamic, harsh, severe environments. At any time of year, you can get super cold temperatures and high winds. There's a lot of mortality of the trees. It's a tough place to live. Birds really have to eke out a living there, and it's also a tough place to work for human beings, for ornithologists. You can see up close here the vegetation. This is very typical. You really can't walk through this stuff. You have to sort of wade your way through it, climb over it. And actually, George Wallace, in his monograph, summed up my 30-year career quite nicely with this statement, I think. You really, you got to be a freak to devote your career to studying this bird. And getting off trail is necessary, but it's hard. And that's one reason that it's been such a struggle, but a great one to learn about this bird. But we call ourselves brute force biologists, and we have prevailed. The other thing, other than just the habitat and the difficulty of getting to some of these sites at high elevations, is the fact that Bicknell thrush, like most thrushes, are crepuscular. They tend to concentrate their activities at dawn and dusk, which in the middle of June is about 4 a.m. and about 9:30 p.m. So it's you got to be willing to, put in the hours, get a nap in the middle of the afternoon, but you also catch some wonderful sunrises and sunsets. Here we are in Mount Mansfield. First one was a sunrise. Here's a sunset behind the Adirondacks and Lake Champlain. No complaints for me, but I will complain about the black flies, which can be voracious. All right, well, our mountaintops, it's quite well known, as I said earlier, are subject or threatened by an array of factors. One of them, increasingly less so now, but 20, 30 years ago, is ski area development. Many of our mountains, as you well know, having Haystack and Mount Snow down your way, are developed for skiing. And there was an effort to expand trails to link some adjoining areas like Killington and Sugar Bushes have joined to adjacent mountains. And there's just been a lot of clearing of habitat and fragmentation of habitat. We don't know what the effects have been exactly. Many of our mountains are festooned with communications towers like these on Mount Mansfield. To create one of these towers, you've got to clear some habitat, you've got to build a road so you can service it. Again, additional fragmentation and loss. Some of our mountains now, you have, I think, the biggest development at higher elevation, at least in southern Vermont, wind turbines. Again, you got to clear, you got to build roads. So sort of cumulatively, we've been whittling away at the habitat. In Canada, I won't delve into this much. The birds are occupying a industrial forestry landscape, which creates a whole nother set of issues and challenges because companies are going in and clear cutting the spruce fir where these birds are. And they are actually using the regenerating early stages of hardwoods, birch and poplar and other things like that, which eventually change over to, so it's an ephemeral system there. But bottom line, our biggest concerns are about atmospheric pollution. We know there's a soup of chemicals in our atmosphere that are coming from a variety of sources, most of them industrial. These are raining down on these forests, which stick up into the airspace, and the needles on the firs and the spruces sort of comb the moisture out of the cloud-laden air. And the chemicals, whether they're nitrous oxides or sulfuric oxides or mercury, rain down on the habitats. And finally, climate change. Arguably the biggest threat to life on the planet, but high elevations are predicted to be one of the first and most severely affected habitat. So the next slide, I think, will remove any doubt in anyone's mind that climate change is a real phenomenon. I hope it won't offend anybody. It's just meant to be humorous. But here's pretty solid evidence, I think, of global climate change across the decades. No, joking aside, whoops, wrong way. We all know what's going on. And as you can see, these mountains are often bathed in clouds and the moisture that's in these clouds rains out. But we do know, as far as climate change, that the forests that the Bicknell thrush rely on and nest in, balsam fir dominated, are controlled where they grow by mean July temperatures. And generally in Vermont, that's about 3,000 feet. Well, as you raise, and there's studies that have documented this, although most of it's through modeling exercises, as you raise the temperature 1 degree Celsius, you push the lower limit of where fir can grow about 500 feet up. Go up 2 degrees, you're going up to 4,000 feet. So you're going to lose a lot of mountains that aren't that tall. And the predictions are then as the area of fir decreases, the number of patches, which are essentially mountaintops, are going to decrease as well. So worst case scenario, you're going to be left with Mount Washington, Mount Katahdin, Mount Mansfield, maybe, just the really higher peaks that are supporting this habitat type. That, I think, is the longest term threat to this vulnerable species because it's so specialized on these forests. All right, now how do we study this bird? I told you we've been doing it for 30 years. Well, what have we done? Well, one of our primary tools has been a mist net, and some of you have seen them, most of you probably, these fine nylon mesh nets, which harmlessly capture the birds. We carefully take them out when we're running the nets, and you can see a bird here in this net, and we affix uniquely numbered bands to their legs. Each number is unique to that band. It's basically an avian social security number. And in the early years, we'd put unique combinations of these colored bands on. So each bird would have a unique combination so that if you saw one at its nest or anywhere else, you'd know exactly who you were observing. You wouldn't have to catch the bird and read its number in a net. That turned out to be difficult because you never see the darn things. Also, having the birds in our hand allows us to sample their tissues. So we've taken tiny drops of blood, which have given us incredible information on their genetics, their contaminant loads. And we've also put little devices, radio transmitters on some birds, because again, they're so hard to follow. You just can't see them in this thick habitat. So if you really want to know where they're going, how they're moving, where their nests are, you put these little transmitters on, which allow you to pinpoint each bird by its frequency at any given time. And that's how we found most of the nests over the years and learned a lot about their behavior and ecology. One of the things we've learned is from the banding, how long these birds live. This bird from Stratton Mountain was the all-time granddaddy, Bicknell's thrush, a male that we first caught in 1997. We caught it 27 different times, I believe, until the last encounter in 2008. I believe 1 year we missed it up there. And it was there, I'm sure. It just didn't fly into our nets this year. So this bird was 11 years old when we last saw it because we banded it as a 1-year-old. So we knew exactly how old it was. And we just for fun figured out, all right, so this bird's wintering, let's say in the middle of the Dominican Republic. That's about 1,900 straight line miles. So it's doing that twice a year, spring and fall. Over 11 years, this bird has flown just on its migration, assuming a straight line, over 40,000 miles. Phenomenal for this little 30-gram bird, barely 1 ounce. What we've also learned, we've learned a lot, but one of the things is how well these birds survive from year to year. We know that adults actually, males and females, survive at quite a high level and come back very faithfully to the mountain in which they're banded. About 65% of them survive from 1 year to the next. It may actually be higher. Now, juveniles are a big question mark. We used to band nestlings when we were finding and monitoring nests. We catch some juvenile fledglings each year. We rarely ever see them again. So we think, so we don't know about their survival. We think those are the birds that are colonizing other mountaintops, spreading the gene pool, not returning to this mountain on which they were hatched and fledged. All right, so nests. You can't study a bird like a Bicknell thrush or any organism really without understanding its breeding system. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. How well it reproduces. What are its problems? What is its fertility and viability? So we spent a lot of time finding nests. They're incredibly hard to find. Once you find one, you're surprised they were so hard to find because they're rather large and bulky, but they nest in the most impenetrable thickets of fir and spruce. And the telemetry is what really enabled us. Putting them on females led us right to the nest. So we found about 100 over the years. And one day on Stratton Mountain, one of our biologists, some of you know him, Steve Facio, was able to observe a nest, which is very rare, from a ski slope. So he was able to see the 5 or 6 meters away. Normally, if you're 5 meters from a nest, there's so many other trees between you and the nest that you can't see a thing. And if you're 2 meters away, you're too close and the bird will not go near the nest. So he was able to watch this nest, and he noticed over an hour or two that there were 2 different male birds coming in because they had these unique combinations of colors and feeding the young. And we came back, he told us about this. We thought, ooh, that's odd. So we came back the next day, and sure enough, it was continuing, and only 1 female. So that raised all kinds of questions about what was going on. And we instituted a study, which, to make a long story short, involved monitoring about 100 nests with video cameras. The only way to really get footage of who's visiting, because like I said, if you're close enough to observe the nest, you're much too close, almost inevitably, for the bird to visit. But we got about 100 nests, and we learned some incredible things, which could be a whole talk in and of itself. But one of the early things we learned by when we were doing the telemetry was that Bicknell thrushes males are not territorial in the classic sense that most songbirds are, like the robin or the song sparrow or the catbird in your backyard. The males are not defending discrete territories. They're moving over a large area of many acres, actually, overlapping with one another. You could have a male singing on a song post 1 minute, 5 minutes later, an entirely different males on that same spot where the other male had been 5 minutes earlier. It was weird. We just couldn't figure out what was going on. But when we started looking at the video tapes, what we realized is that Bicknell thrush have a complex, I would say a bizarre and unique breeding system, mating system. And there's a technical term for it. Don't have to remember it, polygynandry. And simply it just means that both males and females are mating with multiple partners. So males are mating with multiple females, females with multiple males. When we looked at paternity in the nests, by taking a little drop of blood from the nestlings and matching it up to the drops of blood we took from the adults, we realized that paternity was all mixed up in this population. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. So here from our telemetry, these red circles, this is the home range. We don't call it a territory. It's a home range of 1 male bird, the red bird. There are 3 nests inside that home range. The pink bird had 2 nests inside its range, as did the black bird, and the blue bird had 2 nests inside its range. So these males were overlapping multiple females and their nests within their home ranges. And sure enough, when we looked at the videotapes, 75% of the nests on Mount Mansfield and Stratton were being visited by at least 2 males. One nest on Mansfield had 4 different males coming in and feeding the nestlings. Another one had 3. Most of them had 2. So this just raised all kinds of questions. And again, I'm glossing over some of the details here, but we'd have males feeding one nest here in which they might have 1 or 2 young that were theirs, then going over to a nest, let's say 50 or 100 meters away, which they had no offspring of their own, but they don't know that, right? They don't know which offspring are theirs and which aren't. And I'll get to the reason for that in a moment. Now, females, on the other hand, have much smaller, discrete, non-overlapping, we do call them territories. They actually even defend them from one another, are much, much smaller. So really interesting system. So here's what we think is happening in a nutshell. You all know probably sort of bird biology 101 that females of all species lay 1 egg a day. In the case of Bicknell thrushes, they lay typically a 4-egg clutch. So they lay 1 egg on day 1, 1 egg the next day, 3rd egg, 4th egg in 4 days. Each egg is fertilized independently from all the others. A female could mate with several males in a given day. Only 1 male's sperm will get through and fertilize that day's egg. And if multiple males mate with a female, they don't know if they're the lucky one or not. But if they know that they mated with her, they might figure they could be. So basically it's to their advantage to invest time in taking care of those young because they might be their own. So again, it's a crazy system, but here's what's behind it, we think. What we've learned over time is when we look at all our banding data of adult Bicknell thrushes, so this is the ratio of males to females, and these are different sites. A couple in Canada, Mansfield, 2 sites on Mansfield, 2 sites on Stratton. You can see every single site has way more males than females. And these are the number of years. 10 years on Mansfield, we documented, almost 2.5 males for every female. Overall, over the whole species, there are about 2.2 males for every female. Okay, that is not an expected adult sex ratio. We had to ask ourselves, what is going on? Are these birds hatching more males? Nope. In the nest, when we measured the sex by taking little drops of blood, it's 1-to-1. Are more males surviving in the nest and fledging at higher rates? Nope. When they leave the nest, it's 1-to-1. So something is happening between the time fledglings leave their nest, 50-50 male, female, and they come back a year later as breeders. Something was going on with females. We'll get back to that. Here is another interesting sort of anecdotal finding. When we put these video cameras on nests, can anybody tell what's inside this red circle here? It's a little challenging. This is an eye. This is an ear. This is a mouth. This is a Bicknell thrush egg. This is a red squirrel. Turns out that red squirrels are major nest predators of Bicknell thrush and other open cup nesting birds in these montane forests. And furthermore, we've learned that there's a cycle related to the cones production, the cone mast, the number of cones produced in a given year. It tends to be an every other year phenomenon in which following years with a lot of cone production or high mast, you get a lot more squirrels because they come up to feed on those cones. In the spring and early summer, when the cones they've used up, they're looking for other food sources, and passerine birds, songbirds like Bicknell thrush are easy prey. And so the birds tend to have a rough year when there's a lot of squirrels following a big cone year. Another year, the next year, typically, there might be very low production, almost none in some years. You get very few squirrels and the birds do much, much better. So there's this every other year cycle of high cones, large squirrel numbers, low nesting success. That cycle has broken down a bit in recent years. We're not sure if that's due to climate change or what, but that was a really fascinating natural phenomenon that we have to superimpose on all these human caused threats that we're concerned about. Now, another early question we had, because we're working on Mount Mansfield and Stratton, both of which have ski areas on the mountain, are what is the effect of ski areas on Bicknell thrush? Are they suffering adversely because of the fragmentation of the habitat, the loss of habitat? Well, as it turned out, so on each mountain we had an area where we were studying them on the ski area and a similar area on an undeveloped part of the mountain. And when we compared them, we found that actually Bicknell thrush were doing perfectly well on the ski areas compared to the undisturbed forests. So on existing areas, these were both areas that have been around for 50 plus years, Bicknell thrush seem to be doing quite well. The edges of these trails are often very, very thick. They're like those fir waves I was telling you about. The young firs and spruce come up really thickly and the birds love to nest in that stuff. Now, that's not to say if you take an undeveloped mountain and suddenly develop it for skiing, you're not going to have some real impacts in the short term. I think you would. Whoops, sorry about that. Where did it go? Gee. What did I do? Huh. Gosh. How did I, oh boy. Sorry about this. Let's, I don't know where it went. I know it's here though. I'm gonna find it. I'm really sorry. Wow. Any ideas? Any of you technologically oriented people? Oh, here we are. Thanks. Good. All right, we'll move on from ski areas. One other thing, I'll touch on this pretty quickly, is I told you there's mercury raining down out of our atmosphere. And some work done at UVM by grad students showed that high elevations in Vermont and New Hampshire were receiving much higher loads of mercury than surrounding lower elevations. And when we compared these high mercury deposition areas to where we find Bicknell thrushes, gosh, pretty tight correlation. So we had to ask ourselves, well, could mercury, which is a well-known toxin, it's, you know, we all know about that in fish, could it be affecting Bicknell thrush? And everybody said, no, 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 it's an aquatic problem. You're never going to find mercury in a terrestrial vertebrate like a Bicknell thrush. But we said, well, we've got the birds in our hands. We're going to take a drop of blood, a little snip of feather, and we're going to see what we find. So we did that. And we surprised many of our critics by finding mercury in the system of every single bird that we sampled. And concerning was the fact that older birds were accumulating mercury in their systems, in their feathers. The blood just shows you what they've been eating in the last month or two, but the feathers show you what they're picking up over their lifetime. And you can see it increases as birds age. So there's some suggestion that these birds aren't able to get rid of all the mercury that they're taking in, and that's a concern. We know mercury causes problems in birds like loons. It's very well documented that it can interfere with their behavior, their locomotion, their nesting success, their attentiveness to nest. It's not killing Bicknell's thrush outright, I'm certain of that, but it could have some sublethal effects. Very hard to get at. So that just gives you a little bit of background about some of the reasons that I think we have valid cause to be concerned for Bicknell's thrush. But what do we know about this bird? Do we know how many there are? Do we know if they're declining, increasing? Well, one of the things we learned early on, which precipitated our work, was that Bicknell's thrush were beginning to disappear from the edges of their breeding range. So some of the islands in the Maritimes of Canada had lost their populations. Some outlying islands off Nova Scotia and New Brunswick had populations which had just blinked out. And at the other end of the range, Mount Greylock in Massachusetts, the northwest corner of Massachusetts, was the only site that ever was known to have Bicknell's thrush. And it was visited by so many birders, because it was the only place they could get it in Massachusetts, that they documented this steady decline, very dramatic decline, which ended basically in the early 70s with the last sighting or record of a Bicknell's thrush on Mount Greylock. So they were extirpated there. They went extinct on Mount Greylock, some of these other areas, and often for a species that's in trouble, that's where you see the problems beginning at the periphery, the perimeter of the range, and it sort of shrinks into the middle. That was, but we didn't have any of the traditional survey techniques like the US Fish and USGS breeding birds survey that I'm sure some of you have done. Nobody's up on mountaintops monitoring Bicknell's thrush. So we determined to change that, and we implemented a community science project called Mountain Birdwatch. Perhaps some of you have even been a Mountain Birdwatch volunteer. And Mountain Birdwatch simply gets people up on about 125 mountaintops, we call them routes, across the whole breeding range in the US, from the Catskills, Adirondacks, Greens, Whites, and Maine mountains, and has them do standardized point counts, basically censuses at 5 or 6 points on each mountaintop. We're only asking them to record 10 fairly common montane fir spruce species, and of course Bicknell's thrush is one of them. And we now have almost 20 years of data, well, 10 years really of standardized data. And here's what we've seen through 2019. Overall, Bicknell's thrush is not plummeting to extinction, but there is a decline overall of about 2.5% per year over the 10 years really that we've been doing Mountain Birdwatch. That may not sound like very much, but if you project that out, that's concerning. We do know that if you look at individual states, the Catskills are showing the highest rate of decline, about 6% per year. And New York and New Hampshire are both two states with the highest rate of decline. Both of those states have the largest amount of Bicknell's thrush habitat. The Adirondacks and the White Mountains are the core of Bicknell's thrush habitat, breeding habitat. And those are two states are declining. Now, Vermont is the only state that it shows an increase. A small one, it's not statistically significant, but for whatever, I think it's because the birds just love me on Mount Mansfield so much that they flock there to greet me each spring. And no, I can't explain it. But anyway, overall, it's not a great trend, but we need more years of data. Okay. So clearly, this bird is declining across its range, but where are its populations limited? Is it on the breeding grounds? Is it on the wintering grounds? Is it during migration? Is it some combination of all of these? This is called full life cycle conservation. You have to understand what's happening to a species that migrates at every point of its annual cycle to really understand its conservation needs. So the migration patterns of this bird are effectively a black box. We know almost nothing, partly because when you observe a Bicknell thrush on migration, there's no way to tell for certain that it's not a gray-cheeked thrush. The two are just too similar. And so visual observations are almost useless. We tried a device called a solar geolocator, and I won't get into the details. It's a little tiny backpack with a little antenna that picks up a signal from the sun, actually, and records the exact time of day, the sunrise and sunset each day that the bird has it on its back. So you put the thing on, let's say in June, you got to catch the bird a year later, and then you can get a daily reading. So we caught about 20 of these, but there was so much error in the data that we just didn't get the resolution we needed. So basically, the solar geolocators told us what we already knew, that almost all of the birds were wintering on this island here, Hispaniola, which is Haiti in the west, Dominican Republic in the east. About, we think 85 to 90% of the global population of Bicknell thrush winters on this one island. And we know that the island itself has had some real issues with forest loss. Wow, geez, there I go again. The Dominican Republic, which actually we think has the greater number by far of Bicknell thrush, has only about 10% of its original forest remaining, where Haiti probably has 1 or maybe 2%. There's just been a tremendous amount of forest loss, overpopulation, you name it. It's really worrisome to have the majority of the global population of this species on this one island. And here's the typical situation with the habitat. These trees here are about 80, 90 feet tall. They're remnants of what was a majestic cloud forest at high elevation on the Haitian-Dominican border. And they've just been cleared. You can still see some up here. This shot is probably 20 years old, and I bet you that's not even there now, sorry to say. But the forests have been cleared relentlessly for charcoal. Dominicans and Haitians cut trees to make charcoal for heating and cooking, and subsistence farming. There are other things too, but you know, everybody's living off the land. There are too many of them. They don't know how to use it sustainably, and it's just led to a really significant issue. And now, thankfully, so many of these birds live at high elevations. We found Bicknell thrush in the Dominican Republic at sea level, in wet patches of broadleaf forest at sea level, but there's so few of those left that most of them are now restricted to these high elevations. But because the mountains there are very remote, very rugged, difficult to get to, difficult to grow crops in, there are a number of very intact, pristine mountainous areas where populations are quite healthy. And here's one of them in the Dominican Republic. This is a untouched mountain at this point. And here's a shot of the habitat up close in the cloud forest. It's structurally sort of similar to these conifer forests up here, in that it's very, very dense, very hard to get through if you're not on an existing trail, which I am there 30 years ago. And they're wet, they're broadleaf, there's no conifer here. There are pine forests nearby. But this is the winter habitat of the Bicknell thrush. And we've done the same kinds of studies down there with banding birds, putting radio transmitters on them, And we found a very different situation there. Birds of both sexes and all ages are territorial. Each bird defends an exclusive territory from every other Bicknell thrush, whether it's a female, a younger male, or whatever. And they spend 7 months or so on these little territories on the wintering grounds, where they get the resources they need to survive the winter. So there's that whole system we saw in the north of males wandering around. Nope, territorial in the winter. Now, some of them do occupy some regenerating disturbed habitats, which is a good thing. They do have some adaptability, plasticity. We found them in these regenerating forests. We suspect those are younger birds and probably females. More on that in a moment. But one thing we've learned through our banding and studying in different areas is that there's a highly, again, skewed ratio of where females and males occur in the winter. Males, we've spent a lot of time in this southern area here in the Baruco, which is a pristine cloud forest at high elevation. And we've also studied them here in a mid-elevation, lower, more disturbed habitat. So here's the cloud forest. Here's what we call rainforest. And here's the ratio of males to females in the cloud forest, 4 to 1, 4 times as many males as there are females in the cloud forest, and about 1 to 1 male to females in the lower, more disturbed habitats. Again, I have to gloss over what we've, all of the detail, but basically it looks like because these birds are territorial, habitat is limited because so much has been lost. The females are getting the short end of the stick, so to speak. And being a little bit smaller than males and probably a little bit less aggressive, they are, we think, getting kicked around and forced into or relegated to these lower quality habitats where we fear they're not doing as well. Either they don't survive the winter, the food resources are very different. Many more insects and arthropods here, more fruits here, which is not as high quality a food source. So either they're not surviving the winter, or perhaps they're ending the winter in relatively poor condition for the long flight back to Vermont, or they're getting here and it takes so much out of them that, they get here and they're in poor condition relative to males, and you get these nasty storms in late May, early June that can, we don't know what the causes of mortality may be, but we are fairly certain that limitation on the wintering grounds has produced this unbalanced sex ratio, which probably accounts for that weird mating system. There aren't enough females to go around. Other issues we've found from our radio tagging that introduced rats, there are 2 species, the brown and the black rat, have taken a disproportionate number of our birds in all kinds of habitats. You can't go anywhere on Hispaniola or Cuba or anywhere else without finding rats. And when we were following these birds, we found several that had been killed by rats. Luckily, and this must be an adaptation on the bird's part, some birds actually move out of the broadleaf forests, the cloud forest, into adjacent pine stands where they go way up into the tops of the pines and spend the night there. We did studies of the rats. There are way more rats in the broadleaf forest than there are in the pine forest, which are cold, more sterile habitats. So we think the birds are moving to avoid getting predated at night, which is when the rats are out. Fascinating finding. Here we go. Now, adding insult to injury. When we looked at birds in our hand, we also said, well, why don't we sample mercury in birds from the Dominican Republic and Haiti and see how they compare to what we're finding in Vermont and other sites in the Northeast, because the mercury that we would pick up in the winter is mercury they're taking in the winter, because it only stays in their system a month or 2. And what we found is that Bicknell thrush on the Caribbean wintering grounds have mercury levels that are 2 or 3 times higher than what we find here. Again, is it causing an effect? We don't know, but there's certainly no restrictions on emissions in any of the plants down there. So here's a plant that is smelting nickel, but it's producing mercury. We also think there's just a lot of global transport of mercury now all over the planet. So it's just one more thing that these birds have to contend with. So here, I'm sort of portraying the worst case scenario of what these birds are up against. Here's probably the best photo of a Bicknell thrush in its winter habitat in a tree fern in the Baruco of the Dominican Republic. And so we've studied this bird. We've learned a lot about it. We've also followed them over to Haiti, which, not knowing if there would be any there or not, but we found some remnant patches, and sure enough, those patches had some beautiful habitat, threatened, and there are birds there. There are certainly birds there. We actually found some large areas in the southwest peninsula of Haiti that had some really nice forests, but it's highly threatened. The Haitian people are expanding their activities into these habitats, and they may be national parks, but they are not protected in reality. There's no enforcement, there's no resource, there's really even no ethic about how to protect habitats like this. The people are just too, they're too needy. They need their basic needs to be met, and conserving habitat is not on their radar for the most part. Here's a massive Hispaniolan pine on the highest peak in Haiti. These trees this one may be safe because it's on such a big mountaintop, but this is incredibly valuable lumber, you can imagine. So these trees are coveted by Haitians when they can get to them. Just such an impressive habitat. But here is a farmer working his plot of land. This is a farm on this dogtooth limestone, the most difficult to farm habitat you could ever conceive of. And this guy is growing squash and beans and peas in these little nooks and crannies of soil between the dogtooth limestone. It's just eking out an existence in the most bare bones fashion. So we did some work, and I'm going to hurry along because I know this is getting to be a long talk now, but there's so much to cover. We knew that there were other islands that warranted looking. We did some modeling of habitat that showed that Cuba and Puerto Rico should be looked at and surveyed for Bicknell's thrush. We went to Puerto Rico. In 2 winters, we found 11 birds total. They're just not there, not in any kind of number. But Cuba is a different situation. And so for the past 4 winters, except not this one, this, by the way, was the first winter I missed at least one trip to the Caribbean in over 25 years because of COVID. We have spent 4 seasons surveying the mountains of southeastern Cuba. And here I am with a group of colleagues from a Cuban nonprofit equivalent. They don't have nonprofits in Cuba. But this group of young biologists is so dedicated. We had such a good time, and they're so eager to learn and to study this bird. And they're very accomplished. Some of these, this guy is a snail, a malacologist. He was eager to learn about birds, but they have an incredible scientific cadre of really good people there. Here's the highest peak in Cuba, Pico Turquino. We found good numbers of birds here. The peaks in southeastern Cuba certainly have Bicknell's thrush. Not as many, not as high a density as we find in the DR, but they're there and they're secure. These mountains are not subject to the same threats that the mountains of Hispaniola are. The Cuban government regulates conservation. They have park guards. They have a presence there. Nobody's going up in there. There's no economic incentive because it's a communist country to grow crops, cut trees and sell them. So thankfully, the birds in Cuba are in pretty good shape. Now, one of our efforts other than just studying these birds is training our local counterparts, our partners, because really these are their countries. It's their job ultimately to do the science and the conservation that's needed to protect not only Bicknell's thrush, but all of the vulnerable flora and fauna on their islands. And we've spent a lot of time training our colleagues there on how to do the kinds of studies, how to implement conservation practices, and they're just like sponges. They can't get enough. They're so fun to work with. It's so rewarding for me and has been probably the most rewarding part of my work down there. We've done a lot of outreach. We created the first ever guide to the birds of the DR and Haiti in 3 languages, Spanish, French, and English. We're actually revising that guide now. I'm working on that with a couple of colleagues because conservation is all about people. It really is. And if you don't reach out to people and educate them and inform them, you're missing the boat. We've actually brought some of our colleagues up here. Here's a group that spent a month several years ago in Vermont. We took them up to Mount Washington. Here we are in the Alpine Garden. 3 Haitians and a Dominican on the right. And again, we took them to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the Manomet Observatory, the Museum of Comparative Zoology. They couldn't get enough of it. It was just so rewarding, and they've all stayed in conservation in their home countries, which is encouraging. And along the way, of course, we've studied the endemic birds of mainly Hispaniola, but we've done a lot of neat studies on some of the local birds, some of which are among the most rare and endangered in the Caribbean, like this Lascelles thrush here, which is very similar to our American robin, but only occurs in a couple of areas of cloud forest, is very highly endangered, considered to be critically endangered. The toadies, I won't get into all of it because we're running out of time, but that's been a very rewarding part. And for our partners in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, these are the birds that really they care the most about. These are their birds. These birds are found nowhere else in the world other than on that island, whether it's Hispaniola or Cuba. We found the first nest ever reported to science of this bird here, the Western chat tanager. There's so much to learn there, so little that's been learned. And so here we are back, and this is the situation we're really trying to combat. And the work that we're doing now has gone beyond the science. We've sort of learned about the bird, where it is, what its issues are, and we're trying to now implement on-the-ground conservation with our partners and avoid this situation with this woman here who lives with her family, which could be 6 kids, let's say, I don't really know, in this tiny little shack, is doing agriculture on this totally unsuitable property, but has no real options. So we're trying to work with people to give them options through our partners. We've created some private reserves, the first ever in the country, of which part is set aside for conservation, part for growing sustainable crops like cacao or coffee, to give people some economic options. They have to have those, or conservation just can't take place. And I just have to tell you about this, and we're almost done. This is a bird that we captured on Mount Mansfield in 1995. We put a band on it. It was a male. 6 months later, in the remote cloud forests of the Dominican Republic, this bird popped into our net. Unbelievable. Had the same band number. We first didn't believe it. We thought something, we wrote the number down wrong or something, but sure enough, it was the same bird we'd banded on Mount Mansfield. It returned again to Mount Mansfield the following summer and the summer after that. And we had another bird that we banded as a nestling on Stratton Mountain that flew into one of our nets at another site, not the following winter, but a whole nother winter later. So we've had 2 direct links between Vermont and Hispaniola, which just sort of compellingly highlight how connected everything is from one area to the other. You can't pay attention to the north or to the south without taking into account the whole full cycle of where these birds spend their annual lives. And that's like finding a needle in a haystack. I mean, there are so few people that have ever recovered their own banded bird in their own net from one area to another. It's just phenomenal. And this year, we're going to do a new study. We're going to put little, I told you about the solar geolocators, which really didn't pan out too well. Well, now there are these little GPS tags, which are, again, tiny little backpacks. This thing weighs about 1 gram. You put them on like a backpack to the bird, and they give you very precise locations. You only get about 50, they call them fixes, during the course of the year. So you have to program them to when you want them. And then you have to catch the bird again. But we're going to learn not only exactly where birds are spending the winter, but also we suspect that birds are moving around in the late winter and moving off their territories that I showed you that slide of with the non-overlapping territories and going somewhere else. We don't know where, but we need to find out, because it could be a key piece of the puzzle in their conservation. So in about So this summer, we're going to put on 40 tags on Mount Mansfield. We have a colleague in Canada who's going to put on 15, and we hope to get at least half of those back next summer. And then we may have a great story to tell. So I'm going to end now and just say to all of you that if any of you would like to come up, this is Mount Mansfield. Our study plot is right here in the uppermost parking lot of the toll road. You are more than welcome to come visit us. We're up there weekly from early June through early August. It's easy to get there. I could virtually guarantee you a Bicknell thrush in the hand, and you'll, if some of you, I know Corey being one, are looking to see or hear your first Bicknell thrush in Vermont or anywhere, come on up and join us. Please just let me know if you'd like to do that. We'd love to have you. It's a wonderful experience. And I'll just end again with, we have an opportunity to convert this old telecommunications facility here, which has been abandoned for over 10 years, into a state-of-the-art research and public outreach facility. We're working with UVM. They have embraced it. They've raised some money towards this. We're really excited about it, and I hope to, within, let's say, 3 or 4 years, have a real state-of-the-art facility up there, which would just be amazing. So I'm going to leave you with this slide. The future of this species, the Bicknell thrush, is truly in the clouds. It's not certain. I'm optimistic on my good days and a little less so on my less good days, because there are so many threats, facing this bird and its habitats. But I'm confident that if we keep up our efforts and our monitoring, we're going to have this bird for generations to come, so that our grandchildren and their children can hear it sing its spiraling, ethereal song in the forests of Mansfield and other peaks. So I'm going to end there. I'll be happy to take any questions. You've been very patient. I've talked for an hour, and thank you very much.
Chris, thank you so much. If folks have questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Such a whirlwind tour. I know. I haven't even told you about some of the things we're doing.
Chris, what's the status of the Bicknell thrush on Stratton? We found them and monitored them on the bird breeding atlas years ago, and we climb up there and we kept seeing them up there, but are they still there?
Well, Corey was just telling me before you all joined in that he's been up there a few times and not actually found them in recent years. There were certainly lots of them there when we spent 10 years up there studying them intensively, and there were good numbers of them. I can't believe they're not there now. I'm sure they are. I don't know if the population is at the same level it was back then. They were on both peaks, both the ski area and the peak to the south with the tower on it. So I think you just have to be up there at the right time of year, which is basically June. And the earlier or later in the day you can be there, the better, because they do like to vocalize at dawn and dusk. I'm sure they're still there. But we do know that places like Okemo have, their population has dwindled. I think some of the smaller, more outlying peaks are the ones that are going to lose their populations first. And for instance, I don't know if Haystack still has them. I went up there a couple of times and found 1 or maybe 2 birds. That was, gosh, 20 years ago. Has anyone, I haven't seen a record from there in a long time. But I guarantee you they're on Mount Snow. Virtually guarantee you they're still up there. The bigger the peak, the higher the peak, the more habitat, obviously the higher likelihood of finding them and having them hang on.
Eric Slayton posted in the chat box, asked you to discuss migration / stopover obstacles.
Well, the main obstacle is to us humans figuring out where they go and when they go and where they stop over. We really don't know. There's some evidence from the geolocator work that some birds may stop on the Bahamas on their route to the Greater Antilles. But I mean, in terms of obstacles, well, no different than really for any other these are nocturnal migrants like most of our songbirds, and they face threats from lighted towers, from tall buildings with windows, from getting displaced from strong winds that may push them out over the ocean, from being exhausted and landing somewhere where they may not really want to be, and having a predator pick them off because they're a little bit compromised. I mean, really, I don't know of any other obstacles that wouldn't apply to other songbirds. I think we think they migrate on sort of a broad front versus picking on a few key sites like shorebirds maybe, because they're not really habitat specialists during migration as far as we can tell. I didn't answer that very succinctly, but did you have a more specific question, Eric? I could try to address it if you do.
What's the best thing folks in Vermont can do for Bicknell's thrush?
That's a great question. I would say drink shade-grown coffee, except they don't really occur in shade-grown coffee. There's a couple of records in shade-grown coffee. And I don't want to be self-serving by saying support the Vermont Center for Ecostudies, but that would help, and many of you do. So I think more than anything, do what you can to reduce your carbon footprint so that climate change is less of a factor than we fear it's going to be, affecting these habitats. And the wintering grounds are also predicted to be affected by drying up. And that's already, there's evidence that that's occurring. So yeah, doing what we all can collectively and individually to combat climate change. I don't think there's anything more important that any one of us can do for conservation of our natural world, honestly.
Thanks. Any other questions for Chris?
Feel free, anybody, to contact me individually anytime. And I'm serious about offering you, any of you, to come up to Mansfield. It's a long way, I know, from Brattleboro to Stowe, but let me know if you're interested and we'll figure out how to make it happen. Well, thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much for presenting tonight.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Chris. We appreciate it.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Fascinating talk. Really, very, very enjoyable and provocative.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting.